Okay, so now we're going to continue with Foundations of Apartheid, and our second reading assignment, an essay on the inequality of the human races by Arthur de Gobineau. So let's go on with it. This here picture to the right is a picture of Arthur de Gobineau. He lived from 1816 to 1882. Let me tell you something about this man. He lived in the shadow of his family's history. His family was a noble family from France before the French Revolution and the subsequent revolutions. His family had position, title, and power. But over the years, that waned. So he spent most of his life in poverty. His father was a captain of a royal guard for a while, and that salary wasn't a lot. You know, during the days of feudalism, noble families lived off the income from the lands that they were lords over. And after that, you know, you don't have title to the land anymore. Whatever salary you get is your primary source of income. And this is where they were then. So he lived, his father had a poor job. His mother was not from the nobility. His father married his mother. And, you know, when his father took that job, his father was in jail and he took that job as a captain of the royal guard. Then his mama ran off with their tutor. See, back then, there was no public school, so wealthy families usually had an academic tutor that taught the children, basically, homeschool. She ran off with the tutor and took her children with her. Now, the tutor didn't have no money either. Probably just ran off with him because he was a younger man. And they ran off and they lived in different countries in Europe. And his mother made a living through fraud and was even arrested for it. So the Gobineau was ashamed of his mother and did not talk about her. I don't think he even talked to her after a while. So eventually his dad comes back and gets custody of the children, brings them back, raises him. So most of his adolescent years he was spent. His father educated him as far as he could. As far as his education, it was one school he didn't get into. His father still didn't have a lot of money. But he managed to get the Gobineau educated. The Gobineau didn't think much of his father's intellect because his father wasn't intellectually inclined. He had a lot of respect for his own intellect for whatever reason, even though it was questionable. He based all of his thinking on assumptions that most secular intellectuals today don't have. He was deeply Catholic. He was a traditionalist. He was a royalist. Well, I mean, you can't really call him a royalist because the royalty is basically gone, but he believed in the legitimacy of the House of Bourbon. And he became very frustrated with the way things were and with his life because he was poor most of his life. He was poor during his childhood, and he was a poor adult because he started out as a writer. When he didn't get into the school he wanted to get into, he ended up being a writer. And he wrote fiction, and then he became a journalist. He was just writing, trying to get his hand on any kind of money through writing, and he was not making a whole lot of money. Somehow he managed to get himself married to this woman, and his wife was born in Martinique. And his wife was pregnant with their mutual friend's child. And she was like, we need to get married. We need to get married. We need to get married. Because she was a Catholic. And she didn't want to have a baby out of wedlock. So he married her and had at least one more daughter with her, I know. And then he was thinking the reason why people make bad choices like his mom did and like his wife did is because they were the intermingling of the races. So he went through his life thinking that maybe his mama and his wife had Negro heritage. And just to drive the point home, in Martinique, it was not uncommon in any of the Caribbean islands amongst the French. Well, amongst all of them, it wasn't uncommon for them to take mistresses from the enslaved African female population. White men did. And a lot of them would take their children, especially the French, and raise those kids as their own and send them off to France to be educated. So he didn't know if that was his wife's background because a lot of people hid it. Anyway, he walks through life frustrated by the loss of his family's fortune, the actions of his mother, and then he had this wife. So if you doubt your mother's racial purity, then you're doubting your own racial purity. So this man was deeply, deeply troubled. I'm not trying to play psychoanalyst, but I mean that's just the reality. Anybody that if you think being white is the best thing in the best of the highest level of human existence, and you doubt your own pure whiteness, that means that you believe there's some negativity, some inferiority in you. And his idea of inferiority was immutability of this racial inferiority. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get to the book. It was published in 1855. Was not well received in France, but people in other places went wild with it. They loved it. So I put in this PowerPoint some of the fallacious things that he built his ideas on. These are things that everybody believed back then. Not everybody, but a large number of people believed back then. One of them was that there are three races. And this is still taught today, that there are three races: white race, Asiatic race, black race. I've heard it described as Caucasoid, Mongoloid, and Africoid. However, whatever terms you want to use, they believe that these are three immutable types, and that the white is at the top. Well, my interest in this book, and the reason why I signed it to you, because I want y'all to understand that ideas are the most potent factors in human history. And it's these ideas that pushed people to do something as violent and destructive as apartheid. So why did de Gobineau say that the white race was the best? He said, well, look at them. Look what they've done. They're the only ones that he didn't say they were the only ones. He said, but they build the best civilizations. And he described civilization as the ability to coalesce people together, take rule over your neighbors, bring them under your rule, and then also the highest form was to bring large amounts of land under your rule. And this is what's funny to me, because he didn't know African history. Europeans didn't know African history. They made up African history, so they didn't know African history. What's so funny to me is that if he had just looked at something like the Empire of Mali, if he had looked at the Great Zimbabwe Empire, or even the Zulu Empire, but that was during his lifetime when Shaka built this huge empire. He had to have known or read something about it. Those empires were large. They were huge. He did have an affinity for the Persians, because the Persians built a huge empire. But in his mind, the height was Roman Empire, because the Roman Empire was so big. And he loved the Greeks before the Romans. He said these people had real civilization. What do you think about the Egyptians? What did he put the Egyptians? How did he describe the Egyptians? And we know that the Greeks got what they call culture in their learning from the Egyptians. They manufactured this in abridged versions of what the Egyptians had. And they passed that on to the Romans. This was his argument for what makes a group of people superior. And he says in the book, if y'all read the book, and I hope you read it, I mean, it's a long, meandering read. But he said in the book, don't talk to me about no individual Africans or Asians who can do certain, Native Americans who could do certain things. He even mentioned the Wolof, which are in Senegal, the country I study in. He says, I'm talking about groups of people. Don't tell me about individual accomplishments. I want to talk about groups of people. So in his mind, the Africans hadn't done anything, because he didn't know African history. Native Americans hadn't done much. He did put the Asians up a little bit higher, because he knew about the Persian Empire. But he still didn't put them high as whites, because in his mind, the Roman Empire was it. That was to catch me out. And in his mind, the Romans were successful because they were white. For him, his main argument, because remember, he's trying to figure out, that's in the next slide. Anyway, his main argument was the civilizations go down. They degenerate. He has this whole chapter on degeneration, if you guys have read it, when races intermingle. So he was an opponent of miscegenation. Miscegenation is an old racist word which means the intermingling of races. He felt like the people were mongrels, like you got two different races of dogs. Some races argue that whites are a different species. When I was in college, I worked at a cafeteria. There was an old white lady named Joan. Joan told me that whites and blacks were a different species. I said, Joan, that's not right. I said, a donkey and a horse are two different species. And when they get together, they make a mule that's sterile. Well, we were in Arkansas, so people in the country, we know that. And people, they had horses, organized horses and donkeys to interbreed so they can produce mules. Why they have to do that? Because mules are sterile. Because that's a transgression of nature. Because two separate species ain't supposed to interbreed. Well, she looked at me and she said something, then she started talking about birds. I said, you're still talking about different species, John. Human beings, we're all humans. We're the same species. That was Joan talking. And Joan wasn't the only one. If you find one person to believe something, there's other people believe that too. But de Gobineau never said that blacks, whites, and Asians were different species. That he believed that we all come from the same species. But he believed that the races were immutable. And when races intermingle, that's when you see a weakening in society. Remember I told y'all when we were talking about Frances Cress Welsing, you can feel the anger in her writing. But why is this woman so angry? If you read this essay on the inequality of the human races, you'll understand why she's so angry. And it wasn't just idea. People act on this idea. The American society was built upon these ideas. That's why our society is racist. All right. And I know if some of y'all want to believe that American society is not racist, you can go on in your fairy tale world if you want to. I'm not going to argue that because I don't argue about facts. All right, de Gobineau, as I said, was a frustrated person. Because why was he looking at this? And this is when we get to what Frances Cress Welsing was saying, that white supremacy is built upon feelings of inferiority. This man had clear feelings of inferiority. He saw monarchies and the social hierarchy that went along with monarchical society as a natural order. And he romantically looked back to this time. Remember, he was born in 1816. So this society he looked back on romantically had already been dismantled. He longed for that. He didn't know that himself. He just knew from what he read and what he heard. So he romanticized this. Most of his fictional writing was set in the Middle Ages. He thought his poverty was an injustice. His poverty was the cause of these lower races disrupting society, or somebody disrupting society. And later on in his studies, he arrived at it was the cause of people intermingling. And he decried the decentralization of money as a mark of superiority based on one's. He decried the decentralization of money as a mark of superiority instead of people focusing on birth. Because he said, I'm of noble birth. I was born noble. I should be the one that's superior. But he didn't have no money. And in a capitalist society, if you don't have no money, you ain't nothing. You got to have a job or some money or something, some property or some way to generate revenue. Or in a capitalist society, they don't count you as nothing. And we live in a capitalist society if you didn't know. And if you don't believe me, go down there to the store and tell them folks you hungry. And you ain't got no money to pay. They'll either ask you to leave or call the police. And then when you go down to places that help you, like if you have to get food stamps, you go down to the food stamp office, they treat you like you're a criminal. I ain't never went down to the food stamp office, but it's what I heard. I know when I was a grad student and my ex-wife was having my children, I had to go ask for, Medicaid? And those people looked at me like I was a failure. And I remember it took a long time. I went back down there. I said, let me tell you something. You ain't giving me nothing. Before I married, I worked. Y'all ate my check up. Y'all taking taxes and all that stuff out. I said, I paid for this. Now I'm not working. I'm a student. You need to go ahead and give me that. And I got it. Well, I had to call the congressman and everything. But it wasn't because they were refusing it. My caseworker got sick and they didn't assign me a new caseworker until I went down there and raised some sand. But what I'm saying that we don't respect people who don't have money in our society, and that's bad. That's a bad thing. And I'm sad that the de Gobineau had to go through this being poor, because being poor in a capitalist society is not good. And you got to realize something. That society was changing. The society he was born in, the economy then was changing from a mercantile economy to a capitalist economy. And when it got to a capitalist economy, things shifted. That's why capitalism is about modes and means of production. People who just had land, they weren't seen as the wealthiest, because what are you making? Everybody can grow food. What are you producing? These industrialized society is what pushed us into this deep capitalism pit that we're in now. And people, all you got to your name is that you were born to a noble family. So what? You have bourgeoisie families there who were not noble, who had more money than him. He did. So nobody counted that as nothing, and he felt bad about it. So I'm telling you that this book, all his thoughts, are a product of his frustration and his fears of inferiority. This is widely considered the first written work of scientific racism. Now, scientific racism is racism built upon people who sit down and think about it scientifically, systematically think about why these races are, and they make this explanation. But there's nothing really scientific in the modern sense of the word about it, because nothing they say is provable. You can't prove that one race is superior to another. That's ridiculous. But a lot of people believe that. First of all, a lot of these scientific races were Polygenesis, which means they believe that non-whites come from a different species, and they didn't come from Adam and Eve. They came from a different start, and their genesis was different from other human beings. They don't even count us as human beings. He was not like that, because he was a Catholic. He believed in Monogenesis, that all human beings started with Adam. But he believes that Adam was the founder of whiteness. And Adam was white and Eve was white. That's what he believed. And he does not explain how these other races came to be, and how we're supposed to be inferior. He argued that the Frankish tribes, which were Germanic tribes that came into what we know today as France, were not the same, were separate from the Gaulish tribes. The Gaulish people were the folks who were already there, because France used to be called Gaul. He argues that those tribes are inferior to the Franks, who were Germanic. Not only that, he argued that the tribes that were in England, I can't think of their names right now, were inferior to the Angles and the Saxons. He argues that. So in his mind, the Germanic people are this Aryan race of people that's superior to all lesser tribes, even other white tribes. So in his mind, all the peasants in France were Gaul, and all the nobles were Frankish. And he said, well, we get off, our society is messed up when we start interbreeding with these lower tribes and the lower races. This idea carried currency throughout the white world, especially those people who felt like somehow life dealt them something bad and they were really superior, but life would not give them their just due. So they were suffering from some injustice because they're superior and people are treating them like they're not. And another person like this was Adolf Hitler. And another one were the Africana tribes. The Africana people who lived in South Africa, who had been beaten up several times by African tribes. They had been defeated by the British. And at some point, the British said, us white people need to get together. So they got the Afrikaners together and created the Union of South Africa. And then because the Afrikaners had this this inferiority complex, they let them create apartheid. Previously, they didn't have apartheid. Apartheid starts in 1949. We'll get there soon. But it's these ideas on which apartheid was scaffolded. These ideas were the basis for it, these ideas of de Gobineau. Now, our next reading is about Albert Memmi, the colonizer and the colonized, because there are two types of relationships that's going on in the creation of apartheid. There's this racial relationship between these whites and the natives. Then there's another relationship between the colonizer, which was British. Well, first it was Dutch, and then the British came in, and then the colonized. The Dutch were colonized by British and the local Africans. And when we read the colonizer and the colonized, we see from Albert Memmi's work the forces that are at play there. So I hope you guys can read that, and I'm gonna give. I'll make an announcement in the email. All right, that's it for now.